The last time we were in Australia, more than a quarter of a century ago, us coming to Australia was a bit of an interesting thing because, when I was the chief resident at Johns Hopkins, we had the grand opening of the new Neuroscience Center. And everybody who was anybody from around the world was there because Hopkins is sort of like the birthplace of neurosurgery. And one of the big wigs from Perth, Boris Stokes, was there. And he sort of took a liking to me, and he said, "You should come to Australia when you finish your residency to be our senior registrar at a major teaching hospital." And I said, "Australia? You got to be kidding me." That's not what I said, but that's what I was thinking. I mean, where the heck is Australia? You drill a hole from Baltimore, you come out in Australia. And plus I'd heard all this stuff about Australia. But it seems like every time I turned around, there was someone saying, "Good eye, mate, how you going?" I kept running into Australians everywhere, and they seemed like nice people. And every time we would turn the TV on, there was a special on about Australia. And I said to my wife, "I think the Lord wants us to go to Australia." And so we sold all our earthly belongings, and off we went to Australia. And all of our friends were saying, "You're making a big mistake. You'll be back in 3 weeks." But little did they know, we didn't have any more money, so we couldn't come back. But I got to tell you, the biggest problem we had in Australia, keeping up with all the dinner invitations. It was wonderful. It's wonderful when you're a Seventh-day Adventist also, because the people at the hospital, they just couldn't understand how we knew so many people. They said, "Did you live here before?" Every time they would say, "Can you go out?" We'd say, "Well, we're going out with some people we know." "How do you know all these people?" And my wife was pregnant. She was 6 months pregnant when we got here. We had prams, and we had all kinds of things for the baby. And they say, "How did you guys do all this?" They just don't know. When you're in the family of God, all you got to do is pick up the phone and call. And it makes a big difference. But probably the second biggest problem is every time I sat down and started writing in a chart, someone would come up and say, "Do you mind if I feel your hair?" I say, "You can feel it, but it's going to cost you $10. But I figured I'd get my airfare back home. But it was fun because the ladies who were taking the dictations, because I always had to dictate the operative notes, and they said, Dr. Carson, we can't understand your accent." And I would say, "Excuse me?" I said, "I'm an American. You guys have the accent." But we had a wonderful time. And, I understood why the Lord sent me here, because, there were only 4 neurosurgical consultants in all of Western Australia. And once they discovered that I knew how to operate, they did a lot of things at the private hospitals and left me there at the major teaching hospital. I got so much experience. I was doing 3 or 4 craniotomies every day. And when I went back to America and joined the faculty at Hopkins, and the position opened up for chief of pediatric neurosurgery, normally they'd go out and get somebody with a lot of gray hair and a big name and a lot of experience. But they said, Carson knows how to do everything. He's had all this experience. Boom, there it was. So, and it's the way that God works. He prepares you in ways that you don't frequently understand. But, for me, medicine has really been the only thing that I was ever very interested in. I used to love listening to the mission stories in church and Sabbath school. They frequently featured missionary doctors who, to me, seemed like the most noble people on the face of the earth, traveling all over at great personal sacrifice to bring not only physical but mental and spiritual healing to people. And I said, there's nothing more noble that a person could do. So that was my goal from the time I was 8 years old, to be a missionary doctor, until I was 13. At which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out and psychiatrist was in. Now, I didn't know any psychiatrists, but on TV they seemed like rich people. They drove Jaguars, they had these big fancy mansions, big plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. And it seemed like I was doing that anyway, so I said, this is going to work out extremely well. And I started reading Psychology Today. I was the local shrink in high school. Everybody brought me their problems, and I would stroke my chin. I'd say, "Tell me about your mama." And then And I majored in psychology in college. I did advanced psych in medical school, and I was gung-ho. I was all ready. Then I started meeting a bunch of psychiatrists. Need I say more? Now, actually, some of my best friends are psychiatrists. But what I discovered very quickly is what psychiatrists do in real life and what they do on television are two completely different things. And they're actually some of the more intellectual members of the medical community. But it just wasn't what I wanted to do, and I had to stop and say, now what? But you know, I believe that God gives everybody special gifts and talents. And I started analyzing my own life, and I realized that He had given me a lot of eye-hand coordination, the ability to think in 3 dimensions. I was a very careful person. I never knocked things over and said, oops, which is a good characteristic for a brain surgeon, by the way. And I love to dissect things. So I put all that together with my interest in the brain, and I said, you'd be a terrific brain surgeon. And really, that's how I came up with the ideal. And I would encourage all the young people here, as you're thinking about careers, to actually do a little self-analysis and try to figure out where your real gifts and talents lay. And choose a career that takes advantage of those things. Don't just do what all your friends are doing or take the path of least resistance, but use the talents that God has given you. Now, I did start out as an adult neurosurgeon, but I very quickly discovered that no matter how good an operation you do on those chronic back pain patients, they never get any better until they get their settlement. Whereas with kids, you know, what you see is what you get. You know, when they feel good, you know they feel good. When they feel bad, you know they feel bad. You know, no secondary gain issues. And you can operate for 10, 12, 15, 16 hours on a kid. And if you're successful, the reward may be 30, 40, 50, 60 years of life. Amen. Whereas with an old geezer, you spend all that time, and they die in 5 years of something else. So, you know, I like to get a big return on my investment. So, no, I'm just kidding. I like old people. I'm one of them now. But you know, a lot of my dreams of becoming a physician obviously had some interruptions along the way. You know, when my parents got divorced, that was devastating. And I know some of you have been through that. You know, we don't talk a lot about that in politically correct society anymore, about people being careful about who they get married to. And, you know, it's more the Hollywood kind of notion now that you marry someone to have and to hold until you become irritated with them, instead of until death do us part. But you know, the fact of the matter is, when you stop and think about it, you take 2 people from different environments and you put them together. It's sort of like taking 2 pieces of sandpaper and rubbing them together. There's going to be a lot of friction in the beginning, but you know what? If you keep rubbing them together, what happens? It becomes smooth. And you know, people just have to hang in there until it becomes smooth. And really have that commitment, but also, you know, make sure that you study that thing in the beginning. And don't just hop into something superficially, because it makes a big difference in the long run. Well, you know, my mother had a different reason for getting divorced. She discovered that my father was a bigamist. He had another family. And therefore, she really had no real choice in the matter. And of course, we were in a very difficult situation because she only had a 3rd grade education. And so, you know, obviously couldn't make much money. And, you know, she didn't want to be on welfare, I guess what they call the dole here, because she had noticed that no one she ever saw go on welfare came off of it again. So she didn't want that lifestyle. So she worked 2 or 3 jobs at a time, cleaning other people's houses, and hoping beyond hope that somehow, you know, we could survive that way. We had moved to Boston to live with her older sister and brother-in-law in a typical tenement, large multi-family dwelling, boarded up windows and doors, sirens, gangs, murders. Both of my older cousins were killed. It was a terrible environment. I never expected to live to be beyond 25 years of age. I remember seeing people lying on the ground with bullet holes and stab wounds, waiting to die. rats, roaches, the whole 9 yards. But you know, as difficult as my mother's life was, she never adopted what I call a victim's mentality. She never felt sorry for herself. And that was a good thing. Problem was, she never felt sorry for us either. So, you know, there was never any excuse that was acceptable. She would always say, do you have a brain? And if the answer to that was yes, then she would say, then you could have thought your way out of it. It doesn't really matter what John or Mary or Susan or Robert said or did. And you know, that's probably the most important thing she did for us, because if people won't accept your excuses, pretty soon you stop looking for excuses and you start looking for solutions. And it makes a huge difference in terms of what kind of person you become. You know, when I think about people who were not excuse makers, my mind goes back to Chang and Ing Bunker, the original Siamese twins. They were born in Siam in the year 1811, hence the term Siamese twins. Siam, of course, is Thailand now. But they were joined at the chest, something we call thoracopagus or xiphopagus. They were the ones who made Barnum and Bailey famous. Traveled all over the world in the circus. Everybody knew about them. They eventually left the circus and they moved to the United States, to the state of North Carolina, where they became farmers. Successful farmers. Now, can you imagine being a successful farmer stuck to somebody's chest? Staring them in the face, smelling their breath, not using that as an excuse? It was amazing. Not only were they successful farmers, but they got married to 2 different women. And between them, no pun intended, they had 21 children. So you can see they were fairly creative fellows also. But interestingly enough, their wives couldn't stand each other. So they lived with one wife one week and the other wife the next week. And they ran 2 successful farms, and they lived until they were 63 years old, which is much older than most people lived back in those days. So it really does tell you something about determination, but, and not making excuses. But my mother decided if she worked hard enough, eventually we could return to Detroit. And after a few years, we did. Still in a multi-family dwelling with significant wildlife, but nevertheless, you know, she was independent. I was a 5th grade student. I was a horrible student. I didn't think that I was very smart. That was an opinion shared by all of my classmates. And they used to call me Dummy. That was my nickname. But they were actually very glad that I was there, because they never had to worry about getting the lowest score on a test as long as I was there. But I would exact my revenge on them, because I was very good at one particular thing, and that was getting other people kicked out of class. I was extremely good at it, because what I would do is I would study my classmates, and I would figure out what made them really, really angry. And then I would irritate them until they were about to explode. But I would never push the last button to make them explode until we were in class and the teacher was nearby. And then I would do it, they would explode, the teacher would kick them out, and I would say, yeah, this is great. But because I wouldn't be the only one who didn't learn anything that day. Now, but you know, there was this one girl. Now, everybody knows a girl like this in their class. Miss Goody Two-Shoes. Everything perfect, pristine, on time, makes everybody else look like a total jerk. And I said, boy, wouldn't it be great to get her kicked out of class? So I started studying her to figure out what made her angry, but she was hard to figure out. She was just too calm. And, but I finally figured it out. And let me tell you, I had her going. The steam was coming out of her ears. She was about to explode, but I didn't push the last button. I waited till we were in class. And lo and behold, she sat right down in the seat in front of me. And I said, the Lord is good. And as the teacher approached, I started irritating her. I pushed the last button, but she didn't explode. She just quietly turned around, and she said, you and me on the playground at recess. So that didn't work out that well. You know, I became a neurosurgeon and she became a professional wrestler. But, but I did stop bothering people so much after that. But you know, interestingly enough, my mother was always telling me, Benjamin, you're much too smart to be bringing home grades like this. I brought him home anyway, but she was always saying that. She was always encouraging, and she didn't know what to do, and she prayed and she asked God to give her wisdom, to help her understand how to get us to understand the importance of intellectual development so that we could control our own lives. And you know, God gave her the wisdom, at least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was all that wise. Turning off the TV, what kind of wisdom is that? You know, as far as we were concerned, it was child abuse. But she had to 2 to 3 TV programs during the week, and with all that spare time, we had to read 2 books apiece and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. You know, she would put little check marks on it and underline and highlight it and act like she was reading it. And we thought she was reading, but she wasn't. But, you know, even though I hated it tremendously, after a while, I actually started to enjoy it. Because between the covers of those books, I could go any place. I could be anybody. I could do anything. I began to know things that nobody else knew. And within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all those students who used to call me dummy. The same ones who called me dummy in 5th grade were coming to me in the 7th grade saying, Benny, 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 how do you work this problem? And I'd say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But you know, but interestingly, also, I started reading stories about people like Daniel. And I was so impressed with how Daniel, despite the dangers that faced him, always took the name of Jesus with him. He always acknowledged the Lord in everything that he did. He never compromised, even when it came to his own life. Whether he would be thrown into a den of lions, it didn't matter to him, because the only thing that was important was his relationship with God. That story made a huge impression on me. And another story that I read that made a huge impression on me was the story of Joseph. I mean, here he was sold into slavery by his own brothers. Now, did he say, bummer, my own brothers sold me into slavery? No. He said, if I'm going to be a slave, I'll be the best slave there is. And he ends up heading up Potiphar's household. And then, of course, Potiphar's wife says, wow, this is a good-looking dude. I want to deal with him. But no, he had principles. And so she told a lie on him, and he ends up being thrown in jail. Now, he doesn't say, bummer. Here I am living up to the values and principles that I know, and I end up in jail? That's not what he says. He says, if I'm going to be a prisoner, I'll be the best prisoner there is. And he ends up with a responsible position in the prison, ends up interpreting dreams, becomes the prime minister of Egypt, which was the leading nation in the world at that time. And what does that say? What does that story say? It says, you're not going to be protected from all bad things. But it really doesn't matter what happens. You take that situation as long as God is with you and you make something out of it. You don't sit around and feel sorry for yourself and start making excuses. And that's why I believe that God gave us the enormous brains that he gave us. And you know, once I began to read those kind of stories and understand those kinds of things, I began to have a very different vision of what the world was like and where the world was going to take me. And I used to hate poverty before that. You know, some people hate snakes, some people hate spiders. I hated poverty. But once I started reading those stories, I didn't hate it so much anymore, because now I realized that it was only temporary and that I could change it. You know, if you can change something, then it's not quite so bad. If I ask you to stick your foot in a bucket of ice water, you probably don't want to do that. But if you know you can take it right back out, it's not so bad as if you have to leave it in there. And so that was the impression I had. But I still had another problem. I had a terrible temper. I was one of those people who thought they had a lot of rights. And you know, the more rights you think you have, the more likely someone is to infringe upon your rights. So people were always infringing on my rights. I remember once a fellow hit me with a pebble. It didn't hurt, but I was incensed that he would dare hit me with a pebble. And I picked up a large rock, I hurled it at his face, broke his glasses, almost put his eye out. Another time, a fellow was trying to close my locker at school. I didn't want it closed. I struck him in the forehead with my fist. Unfortunately, still had the lock in my hand, put a 3-inch gash in his forehead. Almost got expelled for that. My mother was trying to get me to wear something. I didn't want to wear it. I picked up a hammer, went to hit her in the head with it. Fortunately, my brother caught it from behind. Other than that, I was a pretty good kid, but you can see how you can see how that temper can really get you into a lot of trouble. And you know, one day another teenager angered me, and I happened to have a large camping knife, and I tried to stab him in the abdomen. And fortunately, under his clothing, he had a large metal belt buckle, and the knife blade struck it with such force that it broke, and of course he fled in terror. But I was more terrified than he, as I realized that I was trying to kill somebody over nothing. And I went and I locked myself in the bathroom, and I just started contemplating my life. And I said, you know, you've turned things around academically, but you'll never become a doctor with a temper like this. You'll end up in jail, reform school, or the grave. And none of those options appeal to me. And I just fell on my knees and I started praying. I said, Lord, I can't control it. I just can't control my temper. You're going to have to take it away from me. And there was a Bible in the bathroom, and I picked it up. And I opened it up to the book of Proverbs. And there were all these verses in there about anger and all the trouble it gets you into, like Proverbs 19:19 that says there's no point getting an angry man out of trouble because he's just going to get right back into it. But then there were very encouraging verses like Proverbs 16:32 that says, mightier is the man who can control his temper than the man who can conquer a city. Verse after verse, chapter after chapter, it seems like they were all written for me. There were also verses in there about fools, people who don't listen, people who think they know it all. It seemed like they were all written about me. And I just understood that very day that to lash out at somebody, to kick down a door, to punch somebody, that was not a sign of strength. It was a sign of weakness. It meant that other people and circumstances could control you. And I said, that's not who I am. And I learned that very day to step out of the center of the circle. Don't let everything be about you. And be able to look in from outside. And it makes all the difference in the world. You know, most conflicts in life are due to selfishness. Due to people being in the center of the circle. Somebody infringed on my rights. What are you doing in my space? Why did you take my thing? You know, it's all about me and mine. And you know, when you learn how to release that, it's very, very difficult for someone to make you angry. And you know, when I came out of that bathroom 3 hours later, the temper was gone, and I've never had another problem with it since that day. And some people say, you know, you just learn how to cover it up, you just learn how to hide it. But I got to tell you something. When God fixes a problem, He doesn't just paint over it. He fixes it from the inside. And it makes all the difference in the world. And you know, I adopted God that day, not only as my heavenly Father, but also as my earthly Father, as somebody you could go to whenever you have a problem. But not only when you have a problem, but someone who can be with you, someone you can imagine right next to you, no matter what the situation is. You know, and I used to have an impression of God as this old guy with a long white beard, powerful telescopic binoculars, peering down, looking at every little thing you did and writing it down, make sure that you get punished for it. I wonder where I got an idea like that growing up in this church. We get some strange things coming out of our pulpit sometime. I remember I used to hear when I was a kid that you have a guardian angel. Did anybody ever hear that? and the guardian angel goes with you, except if you go into a bar or a theater, they wait outside. Now give me a break. What do you need a guardian angel for if they only go with safe places with you? You know, that doesn't make any sense. That's craziness. But, we grew up hearing this kind of stuff, and it gives you impressions about God that are not true. You know, God sent his only begotten Son here to die for our sins, to save us. He sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. He loves us. He's going to do everything he possibly can to save us. So where we get these strange ideals from, this is not God. You know, you think about Jesus when he was here on earth. And you know, I just love to read. I never get tired of reading about him. But, you know, he's roaming through the countryside. Thousands and thousands of people just roaming after him wherever he goes. Now, do you think they would be roaming after him if he was saying stuff like, "You're an evil person. Why did you do that? I know what you did." You know, no, that's not what he was telling them. He was telling them, obviously, something very different. He was alleviating their burdens and their guilt. And he was showing them a new way, a new life. And you know, that's what we need to be doing. We need to show people the joy of an existence with our Lord and Savior. We need to let it be shining through the examples of our lives. People should want to be around us. They shouldn't run the other way when they see us coming, because God really is a nice person. You know, I think about people who acknowledge God in their lives, and I could give lots of examples. But I think about George Washington, the first president of the United States. Now think about this guy. You know, the first general. He's leading an army that consists of a bunch of ragtag militiamen who don't even have boots, fighting the most powerful nation in the world. No discipline in his army, no nothing. But he has tremendous faith in God. If you go back and you look at the writings and many of the speeches of George Washington, you could see that he believed that God would bring the nation through. And, you know, there are multiple examples like that, particularly the founding fathers of the United States, all of whom were very, very religious people, had enormous faith. Somehow, you know, that's waning at this stage, and you can see a lot of bad things happening that are going on, because when you try to kick God out of your life, you lose a lot of blessings. There's no question about that. And we should remember that for our own lives. And we should recognize that he loved us so much that he created us in his image. Now, can you imagine what a privilege it is to be created in the image of God? He gave us a brain that in some way is similar to the very brain that he has. Do you realize that your brain has billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections? That your brain remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard. Your brain can process more than 2 million bits of information per second. Now, how many people here remember your birthday? Let me just see your hand. All right, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Now, what did your brain have to do for you to respond to that question? Just to give you an example of how complex your brain is. Well, first of all, the sound waves had to leave my lips, travel through the air, enter your external auditory meatus, travel down to your tympanic membrane, set up a vibratory force, which travel across the ossicles of the middle ear to the oval and round windows, setting a vibratory force in the inner lymph, which mechanically distorted the microcilia, converting mechanical energy to electrical energy, which travel across the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus at the pontomedullary junction, from there to the superior olivary nucleus, descending bilaterally up the brainstem to the lateral meniscus, to the inferior colliculus and the medial geniculate nuclei, across the thalamic radiation to the posterior temporal lobes, begin the auditory processing, from there to the frontal lobes, coming down the tract of Victor's jura, retrieving the memory from the medial hippocampal structures and the mammary bodies back to the frontal lobes to start the motor response at the cell level, going down the corticospinal tract, across the internal capsule, into the cerebral peduncle, descending down to the cervical medullary decussation, into the spinal gray matter, synapsing there, going out to a neuromuscular junction, stimulating the nerve and the muscle. So you can raise your hand. And that's the simplified version. Now see if you can get one of those rap singers to do that. But you know, if your brain can do all that and you barely even have to think about it, can you imagine what your brain is capable of when you actually put your mind to something? And if we are followers of Christ and we are made in his image, we dishonor him when we go around talking about what we can't do. Amen. And we need to be having a much more positive attitude and thinking about, you know, Philippians 4:13 that says I can do all. Not some, not many, but all things through Christ, which strengthens me. It makes you into a very different kind of person.